Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stigma-Free Society's Facebook Live event. My name is Gerry Friesen, also known as a recovering farmer. I am a stress and conflict management specialist working out of frigid Manitoba. Because of my own journey with mental illness, I have a real passion in talking about it because it is in talking to others we can find a path forward for ourselves. You can learn more about me by visiting gerryfriesen.ca. Through this Facebook Live event, I am representing the Stigma-Free Society, which is a Canadian registered charity that aims to reduce stigma of all kinds with a focus on mental health. This event is part of their Rural Mental Wellness Toolkit, an online community-based mental health program that creates access to mental health education and peer support training, as well as practical and relatable resources for those living in rural and agricultural communities. You can find the toolkit at ruralmentalwellness.com. Excuse me. I am excited today to have the opportunity to chat with Richard Whitfield. Hi, Richard.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Richard and I actually know each other, but don't know each other. We've kind of been virtually, I guess, introduced, and today we're seeing each other for the first time. But I know certainly, and you'll find out more about this as we talk, we will be seeing more of each other. Richard is a mental health advocate and a person living with a diagnosed mental illness. As a community affiliate of the Center for Critical Studies of Rural Mental Health, he has participated in several podcasts on men's mental health, been engaged in research projects, coordinated opinion articles, and provided guest lectures to students at Brandon University. Richard is also a volunteer group peer support facilitator with the Westman region of the Mood Disorders Association of Manitoba, and is committed to ensuring that people with mental health disorders and mental illness are no longer marginalized in our communities. And I love to read that, Richard. It really sets the background for what we want to talk about today. But can you start off by telling us what inspired you to get involved in the work you do now?
I can, and the story is like this. I grew up in a small town in central Ontario, and I'm part of the baby boomer generation. So as a teenager, I was in good health. And there was only one particular time where I remember being hospitalized, and I don't really remember exactly a lot about it, but I was hospitalized at 17, and I know that it wasn't a physical illness. And so I'm in the hospital, and I'm in there for 2 days, and they're not sure what's wrong with me, and I'm not sure what's wrong with me. And as it turns out, I was simply told after 2 days that I may have stomach ulcers, and I worry too much. So, okay, that's the way it was. And then after I left, from that point on, there was really just my life going on from there. I didn't ever go back to the hospital for that, but as I kind of went through the generations, I had gotten married. I had a family, I had a very good job. And so in my 30s, I had the opportunity, I actually got a promotion, the opportunity to move my family to Winnipeg, where I worked. And I worked with a Fortune 500 company. I had a good job, and everything seemed to be going well, except it really wasn't. I had really become someone who was able to do work and to do nothing else. And I didn't really know what it was about, but eventually what happened was I ended up I had to take time off work a couple of times. And I had a good EAP program. So I saw the first counselor, and nothing really happened out of that. I went back working, and yet when I was off work, I wasn't doing well. So the second time I was off and I went to see a counselor, I actually admitted to the counselor that I basically was running on empty, and I had suicidal ideations every day. And so from that particular talk, the person I was dealing with actually realized that I was a danger to myself. So I was referred to a psychiatrist the next day. And so really what happened, when you look at it, I had kind of a sense of an understanding what a mental illness might be at 18, but I literally didn't get the professional help I needed until I was almost 40. So one of the reasons that I talk about this, so I'm inspired by working on it, is that the stigma to me, the self-stigma, perhaps maybe a better term is internalized stigma, was so strong to me, I had no ability to cope. I had no ability to be able to understand what was going on with me. And my brain was so distorted, I believed that the illness was due to a default in me. There was absolutely 100% something wrong with me. And whatever that wasn't going to change. So during this period of time, there were at least a couple of times where I really felt really seriously depressed. And looking back on it later, I didn't value life, but far more important, I didn't value my own life. And that was really a key. People have talked to me, and they use those terms. They say, well, you look like such a relaxed guy and a cool guy. Well, they weren't wrong. That's what I wanted to show people. But for myself, I didn't value my own life. So I wasn't that concerned if I was around or not. So that's really how my advocacy, how this whole thing really started.
Yeah, and I hear what you're saying, Richard. It mirrors a lot of my own journey that I'm still on, and I really like that piece when you talk about that internalized stigma that we feel. And I find even now with the way the awareness has been building, particularly in the agricultural industry where I do a lot of work, the awareness is there. More and more people are aware of the fact of what's going on. And yet even I find myself, internally saying, well, come on, Friesen, get over it. You don't need, but we're still afraid to reach out. And then the other piece you talked about is how it took you some time to connect the dots and really understand what was going on with inside of you. And that really resonates with me.
Yeah, I think that for myself, that and I still see it, that I think people don't talk about it because they've internalized that there's something wrong with them.
Yeah.
And they look at a mental illness as being something far different than a physical illness.
Yeah.
And that's wrong, but you don't know about that until you get help.
Exactly. Yeah. I like it. So how does your lived experience with a mental health diagnosis inform your work?
Well, what happened? So I started to get. I went through the process, and I like to say to people. I like to tell people that I'm someone who has good mental health with a diagnosed mental illness. So, and I think that that's really, really important. And one of the things that I did want to do is I wanted to share what I believe is a definition of good mental health. And one of the things, Gerry, that we're seeing today, and I think it's partially due to COVID, is people are using the term mental health And mental health by itself doesn't mean a thing, just as physical health by itself doesn't mean a thing. To me, it's is your mental health good? Is it poor? To say that, I've actually heard people say, well, this person has mental health. Well, we need to start communicating a lot better about what it really is. And a good mental health is not simply the absence of diagnosable mental health problems. Good mental health is characterized by the person's ability to fulfill a number of key functions and activities, including the ability to learn, the ability to feel, express, and manage a range of positive and negative emotions, the ability to form and maintain good relationships with others, and the ability to cope and manage change and uncertainty in everyday life. So the reason I do the work I do, and what I tell people, is that life is not about good or bad. Life is a balance. And the balance has to come with things that can be very difficult. Now, my illness, because of the distortion, I didn't understand that. I didn't have the ability to do that. But as I worked with a psychiatrist and as I worked in psychotherapy, I was able to find, and I was able to actually get better in such a way that I have good mental health. And it doesn't matter that I have a mental illness. And I'd like to suggest, if you think about someone who has diabetes, someone can have diabetes and they will always have diabetes, but they may totally look after their blood sugar. They may have every sense of how to look after themselves. So while they have diabetes, it doesn't affect them. And essentially, that's what I'm saying in relationship to my own mental health.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I think is really important. And of course, that my diagnosis really helps me because I'm able to know, I'm be able to, my own mental health, I know it well. I do an awful lot of research, and you can have good mental health with a mental illness.
Yeah, for sure. Boy, I like that, the way you frame that. So let's switch gears a little bit, and we talked about this just briefly before we came online, Richard, and that is, you're a member of the Center for Critical Studies of Rural Mental Health. I actually became a member of that late last fall as well. I sat in on one meeting, which unfortunately you weren't able to attend. But can you tell us a little bit about that center? Maybe that'll help me learn about it too.
Well, I think in the beginning, and the center started in 2019 out of Brandon University. In the beginning, it was established, I think one of their goals was to accelerate the number of studies on rural mental health and the population, provide research results, and support and education for the community in relationship to mental health. Now, what happened though was, and actually I'll back up a little bit, because for me, I was part of the first study of men's mental health. And from that, I made a really good connection with the center people and leadership. And from that perspective, I then started to work with them and talk to them. And I became, the reason the term is community affiliate, is I'm not with any organization, any nonprofits. I'm literally me. I have experience in certain ways. And the whole point of what they're trying to do is actually bring community in. And this is one of the reasons why I was pleased to talk, is that the Stigma-Free Society wasn't something that I knew before. So I was able to take a look online, and I kind of went, oh, good, there's other people out there, because people can get, and especially in COVID, I think that we can generally get pretty down about a lot of things. But the flip side of that is, just because you don't hear about something good going on doesn't mean it isn't happening.
Yeah, no, and that's excellent. I was actually interviewed for that initial study as well by Rachel Herron, who I interviewed. I believe it was last November, and if people are interested, she did talk about that study a wee bit in that interview. So if people are interested, of course, they can find that at ruralmentalwellness.com. I appreciate your involvement there, Richard. So, can you tell us from your experience what are some of the unique mental health challenges people living in rural communities face?
Well, I think some of the challenges. I think let's start with pretty much the most obvious is the lack of confidentiality that may occur. And going back to that self stigma that I talked about, I don't. I see it as very difficult for someone who is struggling, or someone who's really just having problems. They don't know where to go, and they don't know who to talk to. But they know if they were talking to somebody that maybe other people would find out. Let me use a better example. I started a peer support group in a small town, and as it turned out, we didn't get a lot of people, but we got a number of people who would actually travel. They would travel an hour in a snowstorm to sit in. We were at the Minnedosa Hospital, and they would spend an hour to do that rather than have their cars seen in their own community. So, so that tells you a couple of things. And again, it gets back to that stigma that people have. So the confidentiality, the lack of resources, and that could even include, we could leave therapists out for a minute. That includes the technology that you and I are using right now, right? So, and how difficult it is if you're not feeling good and you really want to talk to somebody about it, but your first chat is going to be with someone through a screen.
Yeah.
That's got to be pretty difficult. So those are a couple of things. The isolation. There could be, quite frankly, the other thing. It could be the fact that the resources that are living in the area that a rural person is living in, that resource might be a cousin of theirs or a friend of theirs, or
Someone you'll meet in the evening in the arena.
right. So how is that supposed to? How can we support someone when we have that type of issue that may come up?
Yeah.
So those are some of the challenges.
And absolutely, and I know with the work I do, both in my conflict work and also in my stress work, meeting people face to face is such a key component in my mind. Because of COVID, of course, I've been relegated to doing this type of meeting for the last 2 years, but also being part of a rural community. And Richard, you had to drive, what, 45 minutes to get to a place where you actually had a proper internet connection.
Yes, yes. I'm sitting at the Westman Region office of the Mood Disorders Association of Brandon. So
And so it's even difficult, like, and so now we end up having to do stuff by telephone, which of course, how do you build a connection? How do you actually make a connection with people you're talking to via telephone?
that is an excellent point. And building relationships, as you well know, they take time, they take commitment, they take courage from the other end. There's so much that's involved in that.
So let's talk briefly about, and I know in 2010, I actually facilitated some workshops in Brandon called Men and Depression, because traditionally, at least, and to a degree still, men and women deal with mental health issues differently. Um, what's your understanding of men's mental health?
Excuse me. Well, I think what's interesting, is that, okay, so for myself, while I was not doing well, um, even as I was getting better over the course of years, and I had a proper diagnosis and things were going well in a certain way, I didn't tell anybody. And I didn't tell anybody because I was afraid. And I was afraid because I didn't trust anybody. And I didn't trust them because I didn't know whether they would be supportive or whether they would, whether I could be ostracized or discriminated against because of my mental illness. So I think for men, it's interesting, Gerry, for men, if someone has a physical injury, if a man has a physical injury, they may or may not be the type of person to talk about it a lot, but they will admit, they will say, well, this, my arm's bugging me, whatever. But as far as mental health goes, again, I haven't had a lot of conversations with people. If I go and sit in a rural community where we're sitting having coffee, I'm careful to offer a basic idea of who I am as a retired individual, but I don't particularly ask people to respond. If they do respond, then we can get that type of conversation going. But it doesn't necessarily happen very often.
Yeah. And it's interesting. You talk about that, again, that physical illness and mental illness. It comes to mind of a farmer I was dealing with one time was starting to talk about how things were changing in his life, and it was clear to me that he was experiencing high levels of anxiety and in fact slipping into depression. And I said to him, you really need to seek professional help. And he made some sort of comment about, well, no, he could, he wouldn't really need to do that. And I said, well, if you go out today and break your leg, are you just going to try and deal with that yourself, or are you going to go see a doctor? And in my mind, and I think with someone like you as well, Richard, because of our experience, because of our ability to talk about this, it's kind of a no-brainer. You go seek help, right? People
Yes.
that, again, going back to the stigma piece, all of that have this difficulty in reaching out for help, and part of that, a large part of that is, and you mentioned it, is a trust issue.
It is a trust issue, and it's also, if I could add, based on what you said, I think as much as anything else, it can be the fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
When you have a physical injury, even though it's a physical injury, you may have some concern. You don't have a fear of the support you're going to get from our healthcare system. And one of the things that I try and say to people is when they do reach out, please don't think it can be figured out all at once. And that's another difference with a physical injury, is that, as well as I do, and I spent virtually eight full years in the relationship to getting the right medication and the psychotherapy and the different things that I needed. So if you were to tell somebody, you've broken your arm and I'll see you in 8 years, that doesn't happen. And yet it happens in mental health and mental illness.
Yeah.
Just way too much.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, Richard. Thanks for bringing that up. One of the key pieces that I really like about what I read in your bio, but also what you've already briefly touched on, is the whole idea of peer support. I'm a strong advocate of that. I'd like to see more of that happen. But tell us, from your experience, how does peer support play a role in stigma reduction and elimination?
Well, for me, if I go back to as I was getting better, one of the things that I did, even though I was getting healthy, I was still ashamed of the fact I had a mental illness. And I went to, I can't remember who suggested it, but I went to a first meeting of Wednesday night bipolar group at the Mood Disorders Association of Manitoba. I walked into the room and there were a number of people there, and I sat down and I didn't say a word. It was a 2-hour meeting, but during that period of time, a weight was lifted from me just by hearing that there were other people that were dealing with this illness. And from that particular point of view, from that beginning to what I try and help now with peer support, it's a huge difference. Now, peer support is not a substitute for therapy. And people need to know that. And sometimes peer support groups and peer support facilitators aren't going to kind of fit in with how someone is feeling. But if you want to go to a place where it is non-judgmental, where you can relax, where you can be supported, where no one will think that what you say isn't valid, that's where you should be, or that's where you could be. Because again, over the years, Gerry, I've probably, through my own needs as a participant and then as a facilitator, I can tell you I've met at least 250 to 300 people, and that's just been amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a strong advocate, Richard, of talking about it. I think, like you say, even if that's a beginning in someone's journey, they're able to talk about it. They find out, just like you did, hey, you're not alone. And even just being able to take that deep breath and go, okay, there is hope here, is enough incentive perhaps for them to go seek that further help so that they can be on a journey of healing.
Yes.
Okay, again, time flies when we do this. I've really appreciated the conversation. So perhaps just in closing, Richard, what are some ways people in rural communities can work to combat mental health stigma?
Well, I think I'm gonna kind of pivot a little bit, Gerry, and tell you what should be involved to help people.
Okay.
And I think that in our society, and I'm going to say specifically in Manitoba, there's an expectation that individuals will require physical health care through their lifetime. And this includes, and we know we can have prenatal care through end of life, and that's just accepted. That's totally accepted. However, in the case of mental illness prevention and treatment, I think that our society tends to think of this as the responsibility of the individual, both in accessing service and in paying. And so unless we impact society negatively, whether we're a danger to ourselves or others, we are not going to get that support. And believe me, I believe if the government was to support, in other words, part of your healthcare coverage, would be able to have psychotherapy as part of that coverage, that would help blow up stigma. Because you'd have the government saying, look, we realize, and they do realize now, but they treat it as a one-off rather than as being part and parcel of what we need to do. And so I wanted to really make that point, that part of the whole problem with this stigma is that our government doesn't provide the services that absolutely they provide for physical illness. And you and I know, but I would say to anyone, take a look at a credible medical book. See what it talks about when someone has, let's say, a mood disorder. Get a sense of what they're needing, and it includes psychotherapy. And yet in our province, if you don't have the money, you don't get the service. Now that's stigma.
Yeah, Exactly. And I think that's a good note to close this off with, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us today. Your insights into mental health and wellness certainly have resonated with me, as I'm sure they have with our audience. I think the underlying message here is it's okay not to be okay. It's helpful to talk about it. Yes, there is a stigma, but hopefully we can all work together to get rid of that stigma so that we can all live a better life. If you've watched this interview today, folks, and you missed something or you'd like to watch it again, you can find this one as well as other interviews at ruralmentalwellness.com. So I would challenge you to go there and seek out more information, because as Richard and I can both attest to, there is hope and there is relief. So thanks again, Richard. And till next time, stay safe and be well. Thank you.
Thank you.